a long time, if you can believe that or not. How do we break church growth barriers? Now, I can look at the ACP for our convention and say that there are a whole lot of churches that are dealing with growth barriers. In fact, I would estimate that 90% of the churches in this country are dealing with some sort of growth barrier in the nature of the church. Now, I believe that God's Word speaks to this, and I want to look at Revelation chapter 3, verse 7. I want to begin with a scripture verse. Revelation 3:7, God's Word says, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, These things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens." Let's ask God to bless His Word. Father God, bless the reading of your Word. Father, bless this conference. Allow it to be inspirational, informative, and allow it to be changing within our hearts, our lives, and our churches. And we give you the glory now in Jesus' name. Amen. Old story of the young single guy who was way overweight, and he desperately wanted to lose the weight. Now, he had tried everything. He had tried Weight Watchers. He had tried exercise. He had tried changing his diet. He had tried Jenny Craig and Atkins and Tybo. And he had done it all, and he just could not lose the weight. And so he went in to see his pastor. He said, "Pastor, I've done absolutely everything I can imagine to lose this weight, and it's not coming off. So I've decided it must be a spiritual problem, and you're my spiritual guide. So, Pastor, I want to know what I need to do to lose this weight." Now, this pastor, he was on the ball, and he had a quick answer. He said, "Son, I want you to get up at 5:30 tomorrow morning. I want you to put a jogging suit on. I want you to put a pair of tennis shoes on, and I want you to be ready to go. There'll be a knock at your door at 5:30. That guy said, "Wow, I've got a neat pastor. My pastor loves me so much. He's willing to go jogging with me at 5:30 in the morning. What an incredible pastor. Cares about me that much." He got up early that next morning. He put his jogging clothes on, put his shoes on. He was ready to go. 5:30, there's a knock at the door. And he opens the door. He's stunned. It's not his pastor. It's a pretty young single girl from the church. And she says with a smile, "The pastor says, if you catch me, I'm yours." And she takes off running. Now, this old boy, he wasn't prepared for that. He got about 100 yards. That's all he was good for. He gave up. But the next morning, he got another knock. Same girl, knocks at the door, says same thing, takes off running, gets a little further. And the next day, a little further. I mean, this goes on for days and then weeks and months. And after a couple months, this old boy had dropped about 100 pounds. He went out and he thought, "You know what? I'm ready." He goes out, he buys a new jogging suit. He gets brand new tennis shoes. And he gets up real early one morning. He says, "Today's the day I'm going to catch that girl." And he's there. He's ready to go. And sure enough, the door knocks at 5:30 in the morning. He opens up the door, and there's a different girl. There's the biggest girl he'd ever seen in his entire life. And she said, "Pastor says, if I catch you, you're mine." Remember when you first went into ministry? How excited you were? How much zeal you had? How much passion? How much you loved the Word of God? You loved the things of God? You loved the truths of God? You loved to study doctrine? You loved the church? But one of the things that I notice almost about every young minister is a zeal to grow the church. A zeal to see God's kingdom expand and grow. Now, I meet a lot of older pastors or even middle-aged pastors who don't have that zeal anymore. How do we become motivated to do what God's called us to do? And how do we continue to be motivated in fulfilling God's calling in our life? Now, you remember that church in Philadelphia we read about just a second ago in Revelation 3:7. When we read about that church in Revelation 3:7, I want you to know that God has given us an obligation. God has an obligation that He's given to every one of us as believers. God's Word says in Revelation 3:7, "These things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens." Now, I know I ran out of handouts. Some of you got a handout. Some of you we ran out. I'm sorry about that. But I want you to think about this church. This is the Church of Philadelphia. Church of Philadelphia is an interesting church. It's in Asia Minor, southeast of Sardis, in modern Turkey. It was founded by King Attalus II in honor of his brother Eumerus. And we know Philadelphia as a city of
Brotherly love.
brotherly love. You know the sermon. You've heard the sermon. What you may not realize that of the 7 churches in Revelation, Philadelphia is the smallest town, the most insignificant town. In fact, it's kind of surprising that the town's even mentioned, because it wasn't a place that you'd go to. It's a place that you'd go through, but it was not a place you'd go to. This was a church in the cornfield that you drove by on your way to the big city. Now, in the old days, you couldn't just go where you were going. You had to stop along the way. And so apparently the believers in the church of Philadelphia were given to hospitality. And so when someone would travel through Philadelphia on the way through that mountain pass, they couldn't stop at the local Motel 6 or spend the night at Holiday Inn or eat dinner at Cracker Barrel. They would have to reside with one of the residents. And apparently the believers were prone to hospitality, so they would invite them into their home. They'd feed them a meal, they'd provide them a bed, and they'd share with them Jesus Christ.
Amen.
And these people would be saved, and then they'd go on to their homes, their towns, to see their family, their friends. And the church of Philadelphia was not the largest of the 7 churches. I do not believe it was. But it was the most influential of the 7 churches, because God had provided them an open door. Now, I believe in every church, I really believe this, in every church, God has provided some open doors, some opportunities for you to be the church that God wants you to be. God has called us to go. We have no doubt about that. And I believe that growth should be expected. Matthew 28 says, "Go ye therefore." Literally it says, as you're going. God expects His church to grow. I believe that you and I should expect our churches to grow. I think that should be a natural expectation. I believe that growth is natural. Acts 2:47. Acts 2:47 said that God added to the church how often? We had a goal at First Baptist Maryville this year, or last year, to have 365 conversions. Why? Because the Bible says that God added to the church daily. Now, I'm not saying that's a goal that you should have. That was a goal that God impressed upon our heart. God expects His church to grow, and I believe that growth is natural. It should naturally happen. I have 2 little girls, 11 and 13. They are wonderful girls, and they keep growing and growing and growing, and I expect them to grow. If they stopped growing, I'd be making a doctor's appointment. You know, we live in an age that when a church is growing, it's suspect. They must have watered down the gospel. They must have changed something. They must not really believe the truths of God. And it's strange that we live in an era where 90% of our churches are plateaued and declining, and yet we don't question that. We question the ones that are growing. Well, they must just be swapping other people's people. I also believe that growth is supernatural. Growth is supernatural. Now, Jesus says in Matthew 16:18, He says, "I will build my church." Man, I don't want the church you can build. I don't want the church that I can build. I want the church that Jesus can build. And so while I expect the church to grow, and I believe that the church should grow naturally, I also believe that the church should grow supernaturally. It should grow because of Jesus Christ. Now, in every situation, God has given us opportunities. You say, well, I don't have the opportunities that you have. Folks, I came to pastor a church years ago in a town of 500 people in the middle of a cornfield with less than 4,000 people in a 3-mile radius. Okay? Now, you may have less opportunities than that, but wherever God's placed you, there are opportunities for your church to grow. Now, if we're going to have opportunities, we need to know where the doors are open. He says, "I know your works. See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it, for you have a little strength. You have kept my word. You have not denied my name." Wherever God's placed you, He's placed you in a place where there are opportunities to build His kingdom. Now, what we're going to focus on today is about discovering those opportunities and meeting God there. Now, what are those opportunities? First, It is our responsibility to observe where God is at work. It is our opportunity, it is our responsibility to observe where God is at work. Now, this is tough. Henry Blackaby wrote an awesome work years ago that you're very familiar with called Experiencing God. And we as Southern Baptists were great 20 years ago about taking his principles and applying them to individuals. And I think the challenge in the next 20 years is, can we take the same principles and apply them to churches? Don't you hear me on this? We need to become, as church leaders, discerners and observers of where is God at work in my congregation. What most churches try to do is they try to create growth rather than observing where God's at work and joining Him there. Let me give you an example. When I came to First Baptist Church, Maryville, I was 23 years old. The guy before me was old. The guy before him was young. The guy before him was old. The guy before him was young. The guy before him was old. You got the pattern? I can go back. I can literally go all the way back to 1945 with that pattern. Literally. You know what the average length of tenure of pastor was? 15 months. Hired an old guy, he didn't work out. Well, we needed a young guy. Hired an old guy, he didn't work out. When I got there, the average age was close to 60 of the congregation. There were no preschoolers, none. There was no children's program, none. There was no youth program. And when I say none, I mean zero, none. They didn't exist. And so there's a church. We're all senior adults. What do we need to do? We need to hire a young pastor. The last guy was old. We need to hire a young pastor. Churches tend to react. And so what we tend to do is we program toward weakness rather than strength. Now, I hope you catch this. I'm going to use this illustration. And maybe the same guy's here 6 years ago when I did this conference, but I had a guy 6 years ago who told me, I asked everyone, where's God at work in your church? This guy described that he was in a rural setting in Ohio, miles from the nearest town. And he said, well, God's at work in our youth ministry. He said, in fact, we've had someone give us an endowment, and we're going to go out and hire a youth minister with this endowment. I said, really? Well, how many youth are in your church? He said, well, none. I said, how many youth live within a 3-mile radius of your church? He said, well, we're just farmers. We don't have any young people within 3 miles of our church. I said, well, where's God at work in your church? He said, well, in the youth ministry. There's so many of you who have well-meaning lay people who say, Pastor, we need to start a youth ministry, we need to start a children's program, we need a preschool choir, and all these things. It's like drinking from a fire hose, isn't it? And we spend so much time trying to keep up with everybody else's ideas that we never as a church really observe where is God at work and join Him there. So it's our responsibility to observe where God's at work. Let me give you an example, and I think you guys will catch this. When I came to First Baptist Church, Maryville, I was 23. I love sports, and I have a church of senior adults. And the second year I'm there, maybe it's the second year I'm there, we put together a church basketball team. And, it was sorry-looking slop. And in Metro East, there used to be, I think there still is, a basketball league. When we joined that, the teams were predominantly from East St. Louis. And I remember one church in particular, Macedonia Baptist Church, had a guy who was 6'10" and had tried out for the Portland Trail Blazers. And we played Macedonia Baptist Church in 1988. And we lost 88-4. of aces, guys that didn't get 5 or 10 or 15, but guys who got dozens of kills. Can you imagine that, going up there in the face of the enemy and having a 50-50 chance of coming back and winning dozens of times? The Germans in particular created several of these aces of aces. And there was a man named Paul Rossmann who was injured at the beginning of the war. And he had a limp arm. He basically just had one arm to fly with. And in those days, you didn't have all this power electronics, and the battle went to the strongest and the fastest. And here's a guy, I can imagine a boxer with one arm. He's flying a plane with one arm. He really shouldn't be up there. And he developed a strategy called See and Decide. And his strategy was basically, when I see the enemy, I'm going to immediately determine, do I have the advantage? If I have the advantage, I'm going after him. And I'm going to immediately determine whether I have the disadvantage. If I have the disadvantage, I'm going to run away as fast as I can. And I'm going to determine, are we on equal footing? And if we're on equal footing, I'm going to run away as fast as I can. Now, Paul Rossmann, with one arm, achieved the status of ace of aces. He achieved 87 kills with one arm. He trained a young man named Eric Hartman. And Eric Hartman had two good arms. And Eric Hartman had 352 kills. Survived the war. And was never shot down by airplane fire. Was brought down by ground fire a couple times, but was never shot down. All the way to the point where, there's 10 American fighters waiting for the plane to come up. Survived the war. Now, I want you to imagine that you're Major Eric Hartman. You're the best of the best of the best. And you see some little Russian flunky plane coming at you head to head, and you have equal status. You're the best of the best of the best. You're the best there is. You're the Michael Jordan at fighter pilots. And there's a guy coming head on to you. Well, I could take him. No, he ran away. He ran away. He only fought when he knew with absolute certainty that he could win. And he lived through the war. We need to recognize, where are we absolutely certain that God's called us to go? And so we're always approving things and affirming things that we don't have any sense of spiritual certainty that needs to happen. I was thinking about this earlier this week. I spend the vast majority of my time saying no to stuff. Good stuff. Some may even say great stuff, but not God stuff. We want to say yes to what God says yes to, and we want to say no to everything else. And our churches are full of programs and activities that God doesn't have anything to do with. I'll tell you a little bit of where I'm coming from. Some of you don't know me, so I want to give you an opportunity to know a little bit more about my background. I came to First Baptist Church Maryville in 1987. I preached there February 1st of 1987. I preached to 22 folks, and that building was built in 1941. It looks a lot worse than the picture. The church was in the process of relocating. We relocated in May of 87 and had a $48,000 budget. Just a little tiny struggling church. And they made this big decision to relocate. We relocated into 5,000 square feet. The auditorium was just a little fellowship hall, 30 by 40, a little wider than this room, 12 feet, 15 feet longer than this room. That's where we started. And God began to bless. We began to grow. We made a decision in faith, and it was just kind of a God thing. We had designed, original design was for a 150-seat auditorium to go into the front of that building. And we grew fairly rapidly, fairly quickly. We began to pray, and we decided to build a 400-seat auditorium instead. And obviously the bank wasn't going to loan us any money. We originally had a $48,000 budget, and we'd grown from that. We had $125,000 debt from relocating. And we went to the bank and said, hey, we'd like to borrow about $400,000 to build a new sanctuary. And they thought we were nuts. And so literally we had 7 families in our church step forward and put up their home for collateral. Against the bank will always give you money, but they just got to have something to take away. If you don't follow through. We continue to grow, and in the year 2000, we relocated onto a new 35-acre site. We added an additional 35 acres to that, and we've done 3 additions to that site since we've gotten there, and we'll do another addition next year as well. We're currently on 78 acres, 77 acres in the middle of a cornfield. I mean, there's corn to our south, east, west, north. We're in the middle of a cornfield. God has just really blessed, and we've seen some neat things happen. Right now, we've got a master plan for our 75 acres, and God continues to allow us to see some really phenomenal things happen over the years. There's our growth attendance over the years. First Sunday I preached, we had 22. Last Sunday we had 1435 or something like that. So obviously the church has grown a little bit. Reason I say that, I want to tell you why I'm saying this. That's a point back to me. I remember going to conferences like this, to being a pastor of 80 people or 40 people, and a church in a cornfield, and listening to somebody at a church of 2,000 and saying, man, they don't have any idea what it's like. You've done that, right? You know, this guy doesn't know where I'm coming from. And folks, I've shared this in downtown Miami. I share this conference for National Baptist every year in downtown Chicago and Maywood. And I know wherever I go, people think, well, you just don't know where I'm at, okay? Man, I've seen about every number you can imagine, okay? And I know what it's like to be a pastor of 30 people and make $11,000 a year. I've been there. Got the T-shirt sold at the garage sale, okay? I've been there. The reason why I want to say this is because I have found that there were certain barriers you face along the way. And what happens is most pastors spend 3 years here, and they go to a bigger church, and they spend 3 years there. You know, that's what was the case of our church. If somebody was any good, they'd spend 15 months and they moved on. If they were really bad, they spent 15 months and they got fired, okay? And so most of us aren't familiar with how do you actually break those growth barriers. And so what I did was, years after breaking those barriers, I went back and said, what did we do? I can't tell you that when I was going through them, I knew what we were doing. But as I look back, I can look back and say, what did we do to break those growth barriers? Well, in Revelation 3:9, we see it's clear there's obstacles to growth. It says, indeed, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they're Jews and not, but lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet. There are obstacles to growth, and Satan is that obstacle. Now, as we look at those obstacles, I want you to note with me 3 different church types. The first church type is the small church. Under 200, really we should say under 150 is probably a better number. I want to describe the small church and then the medium church is probably 200 to 800, really probably about 150 to 800. Large church is over 800. Now, I don't like this description. The reason I don't like this description is because when we say small church, you know, if you divide something small, medium, large, you figure 1/3 here, 1/3 here, and 1/3 here. When I'm talking about churches of 200 or less, I'm talking about almost every one of you in this room. Okay? There are some aspects, particularly if we talk about 150 or less, that make your churches similar. So if you pastor a church, you know, I go to Maywood every year in Chicago. I mean, it's down, it's in the hood. It's in the south side of Chicago. I have a great time with those guys there. If you pastor a church that runs 110 in Maywood, the dynamics are the same thing as if you pastor a church of 110 in Lick Creek, Illinois, out in the country. Okay? You say, well, those are 2 different worlds. You're exactly right. But the dynamics are the same. We do a lot of work in Zambia. Same deal. If a church runs 100 people in Zambia, it has the same kind of dynamics because people are people wherever you go. Culture's different. mentalities are different, I understand, but we function the same way when we're in small groups. Medium churches are next size and then large. Now, let's look at first the small church. The small church is the same regardless of your cultural setting because of this reason. You are basically a single cell. You are a one-cell organism. What does that mean? Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone. So if you have a small church, basically I'm saying if you have a church where everyone knows each other, you're a small church. Okay? When I came to Maryville, well, actually when I started dating my wife, she asked me, she said, what do you like to do and what do you not like to do? And I said, well, I don't like to bowl. And she said, that's good. I hate bowling too. And when we came to Maryville, we found out that there were 22 folks from our church who bowled on a Saturday night Baptist Bowling League. First thing we did when we came back from our honeymoon, 23 and 18, we signed up for a 42-week long bowling league. Business meetings weren't on Sunday night. Business meetings were on Saturday night. If it passed on Saturday night, it was going to pass on Sunday. If it didn't pass on Saturday night, we didn't bring it up on Sunday. There's no point. I mean, the whole church bowled. Okay? You're a single cell. Okay? And so small churches are single cell churches. They are, and guys, please catch this. If you're in a small church of less than 150, you are in a duet. Now, I can't sing. I don't know anything about music, but you are in a duet. It's the pastor and the congregation. That's the duet. If someone's out of tune, who is it? Guys, I want you to hear me on that. If someone's out of tune, it's the pastor. You're singing a duet if you're in a small church. And so you've got to make sure you and your partner, you and the congregation, are in harmony together. It's essential. Greatest challenge in the small church? Culture. Culture. Does the church want to grow? Does the pastor want the church to grow? Do the people want to grow? Churches don't grow, I believe, in general because people don't care. Apathy. The culture of the small church keeps it small. Small churches are small. Why? Because they want to be small. Man, I was in Miami last year, and just dropped my water there. I was in Miami last year. Millions and millions and millions and millions of people. Average size church in Miami-Dade Baptist Association. Less than 50 people. Great folks there, great pastors. Got to talk to Haitians and, about every background you could think of. But people are always, it's just hard to reach people. There's so many lost people around you. I would love to have hundreds of thousands of people around our church that we could reach. I was ready to pack up and go to Miami so I could reach people because we're surrounded by corn. Small churches are small because of the culture. Medium churches. Medium churches are not single-celled, they're multi-celled. So when we came to Maryville Baptist Church, we had 2 Sunday school classes. We had the ladies' class, and we had everybody else. Those were the 2 classes, okay? Eventually, you start adding classes, and you add ministries and programs, and you go from single-celled to multi-celled. The medium-sized church is a quartet. You have pastor, you have the staff, you have key lay leaders, and you have the congregation. Because, boy, this is a different animal altogether, isn't it? Okay? And so the medium church is completely different organizationally. Now, it's key then that we recognize that we're going to function differently. And so your location, your ethnic background are really minor differences compared to this difference. Once a church starts adding staff, which is usually about 150, and by adding staff, I'm talking about full-time guys that are really there. Some churches have, some little churches that have 5 guys that are, on staff on name. They're great lay people, but, when I'm talking about having full-time paid staff or folks that spend the majority of their time at that church working, now you've got to manage that. You've got to make sure they're in tune. You've got to make sure the congregation's in tune. You've got to make sure the leadership's in tune. And it's a different beast altogether. Greatest challenge? Organization. Organization. How do you keep these guys all singing the same song, move in the same direction? How do you keep creating Sunday school units? How do you make sure that things function as they should? And so organization is the key issue. The large church is over 800. It is congregational. It is not one cell. It is not multiple cell. It's just all over the place, okay? It is just huge. It is an ensemble. Now, I'm not even sure what that means, because I don't know anything about music. But, I understand, if you've got a choir, you've got altos and tenors and bass and sopranos. I was at a big meeting once, and they asked everyone to sing those different parts. And I asked my wife which part I had. She said I had no part. And so you've got to organize the different sections, and then you've got the band, and you've got the orchestra. And so now you're not just talking about a quartet. You're talking about all kinds of different parts. And how do you bring it all together and make sure they're all moving the same direction? This is essential, folks. Greatest challenge in the large church? Leadership. Leadership. Now, I love all the stuff on leadership. I read all the books, aware of all the material. Some of you are way too obsessed about leadership. Interesting stat. I want you to catch the stat. 3% of the churches in our country run over 800. 3% of churches run over 800. Barna did a survey a few years ago. 3% of pastors identified themselves as having the spiritual gift of leadership or administration. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Now, I just want to challenge you, where you are, where God's placed you, be what God's called you to be and do, and God will take care of the rest. But that's the key issue in the large church is how can you get everyone move, all this ensemble, all moving together in the same direction, the same fashion. I've had the opportunity over the years to pastor 7 different churches over the last 21, almost 22 years. They've all had the same name, but I've pastored 7 different churches. The first church I pastored was in 1987. It was a little church in a white frame building, making a relocation to a new facility 2 miles away. We averaged 32 people the year that I got there. It was single cell. Everyone knew everyone. We were just one little tiny family. And that was the first church I pastored. We began to grow, though, and remember we're in a little tiny room like this? We had to add another. This is tough. I think one of the most traumatic things to do is to be a super small church and have to add a second service. To me, it's just a terrible thing to have to do. That's what we did. 1988, we added a second service. And so the first church I pastored was a single-cell church. Everyone knew each other. But suddenly, a year later, we had to start an early service. We had an 8 o'clock service. And now we had, in a sense, 2 cells. We were still a small church, but we were 2 cells. And so it was, in a sense, a different church. In 1990, we built a new 400-seat sanctuary, and so now we were all back together again, but we were over 150 people. And so, in a sense, we were a different church again. We weren't the same church that we were 2 years before or even a year before. In 1991, we began to grow, and we added a second worship service. So there we back. We built this 400-seat auditorium with the concept that, hey, we're all going to be in one church service together. Well, a year later, we're in multiple church services again. By 1997, we add a third worship service. One of my favorite stories is 2 ladies in Walmart inviting each other to church, and they found out they were both inviting each other to the same church, and they'd both been attending the same church, First Baptist Church Maryville, for 2 or 3 years. We were only a church of 450, but we had 3 worship services and 3 hours of Sunday school. And so that was a different congregation. And then we became a large church. At that point, we began to hit 800, close to that. In the year 2000, we relocated. And when we relocated. Now remember, we started this dream with 30 senior adults. We cast, and we joke we relocate every 10 years. We made the decision to relocate. We sold it with the concept that we were going to be in one worship service again. And so we relocated in 2000, and 8 weeks after we relocated in a new 1,000-seat sanctuary, we had to add a second worship service. People said, why did we build it so small? Or why did you guys build it so small? It's like, well, we only had 400 people. We made the decision to relocate. We thought we were, 400 to 1,000. We thought we were making a pretty aggressive decision there. Each one of those churches were different. This past Sunday, we went back to 3 worship services again. 3 hours of worship, 3 hours of Sunday school. And we're going to add a 4th worship service on Sunday morning this fall. Things keep changing. First Sunday, we were in the new building in 2000. We had been running about 600. First Sunday, we were in the building. Relocated. Awesome site. We had 1,256 people show up. I mean, I literally don't think I touched the floor twice that whole time. That whole service. And I walked out in the foyer, and here's this massive complex that God had blessed us with. And I walk in the foyer is just packed with people. And while I'm out there, I'm just excited. I mean, just feel the electricity, excitement of what God has done. And I hear this cry, this howl out of the corner of the foyer. I'm like, what is that? I begin to work my way, and I'm going to kind of fight through the crowd to get there. What is going on? And there was one of the ladies who'd been part of our church since 1988. And she was just sobbing in the corner, just crying. And I thought, her dad had been sick. I thought her dad died. And I went up to her, Susie, are you okay? Are you all right? And she turned around and she said, this isn't my church anymore. This isn't the church that I joined. Man, change is hard. And I think sometimes when we look at those changes we see, just the positive aspects, it's not easy for a member to be a member of 7 different churches with all one name. And so change is challenging. Well, how do we overcome growth barriers? Who's my timekeeper? What time is it? 10:15. I got how much time? 30 more minutes? Okay, 30. Whatever. You guys are great. I like that. Overcoming barriers. You guys are getting the abbreviated version. Overcoming barriers. Revelation 3:12. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. He shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God. And I will write on him my new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. God has got a plan. And there are some obstacles. And what we want to do is we want to identify what are the obstacles that are keeping our churches from growing. And how do we overcome those obstacles? And so the key thing is, let's observe, where's God at work? And what do we need to do to get there? And what are the obstacles that are keeping our church from being the kind of congregation that God's intended? Now, what I'm going to talk about from here on out is just real basic stuff. And it's stuff you've heard over and over and over again. And what I want to do is I just want to be a living testimony that it works and that matters, okay? First, we need to seize the vision. We need to seize the vision. 2 questions that you need to ask yourself and the church. Number 1, is the pastor and the staff willing to pay the price? There's a price to be paid with growth. Man, I gotta confess to you, I'm 45. 10 years ago, I was doing 3 worship services. I lost my voice every February. The year I was completely silent for over a week at times when we had those 3 worship services. was preaching 3 times Sunday morning, once on Sunday night. And on a personal level, I can't say that I'm really excited about preaching 3 times Sunday morning. That's hard.
That's right.
That's hard. We're talking about adding a 4th service at 12:23 in the afternoon in the fall. Am I personally excited about that? I mean, you got to be a sadist or something to be personally excited about doing that, okay? Okay. At the same time, the first Sunday that we did that 8:15 service, you kind of like, is anybody going to show up? I mean, I could tell the band, the music, the choir people, the sound people, the video people, they're all waiting, is anybody going to show up? We got a good crowd at 8:15, and 9:30 was packed. I mean, just packed. And so it was kind of like, when we preached 8:15, okay, we had a good crowd. It's 8:15. You're not expecting like 500 people at 8:15, but it was a good crowd at 8:15. But then when the next service is packed, it's like, okay, God, you were right. We need to do this at 8:15. We needed to start that service. Okay, there's a price to be paid, and one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, if you want to be a pastor or a leader, and I'm going to apply this to everyone, if you want to be a leader in a growing church, there's a price to be paid. Those 7 families that signed a note to put up their house as collateral in 1990. Man, I was 24 then. I've got to confess that as a 24-year-old pastor, I had no clue what they really did. I went back to one of the ladies who is actually one of our custodians now, and I went to Doris recently, and I said, Doris, I want to thank you for what you did back in 1990. I want to tell you, as a 24-year-old pastor, I had no idea what you were doing. And I want to thank you. And she said, Pastor Fred, to be honest, I didn't have any idea what we were doing. I'm not sure I would do it again. The second question is, are the people willing to sacrifice? Are the people willing to sacrifice? If you have folks like Gene and Doris who are willing to put their house up as collateral, and you have pastoral leadership who are willing to preach 3 times, who are willing to do whatever it takes, your church will grow. I really believe that.
Sure.
But those are the 2 key issues. Now, I get asked all the time, man, I don't know if my congregation's willing to sacrifice. I don't know if they really want. Then you need to pray if you're in the right place. There's no reason to do a whole bunch of changes. One of the best things I got out of my doctorate program when I was working on my doctorate was a young guy asked, he said, I'm going to be at this church. He said, I'm at this church, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to change this, I'm trying to change this, and I'm trying to change the worship, I'm trying to change this. And the guy who was leading the seminar said, how long are you going to be there? He said, well, what do you mean? He said, are you staying? He said, well, I graduate in 18 months. And he said, are you staying after you graduate? I looked down. Well, probably not. He said, don't change anything. They're going to change back the Sunday after you leave. There's some doctrinal things that need to be changed in some places. Change those. But, man, if you're changing things that the Sunday after you leave, they're going to change back, and you're not staying, why go through that? It's not worth the headache for you, and it's not worth the heartache for them. Recognize, are you willing to pay the price? Are you willing to stay? I came to a church that had an average tenure of 15 months. I've been there 21 years. Average church pastor leaves because of 7 people. I've always joked I could have left because of 70 people at different times. Still there. Are the people willing to sacrifice? See, this is the vision. Second, staff. I realize many of you probably don't have, most of you probably don't have full-time paid ministerial staff. Someday you will. And I want to give you these key thoughts. Number 1, enlist the right people. Folks, it is so important that we get the right people. Peter Drucker says the top CEOs in the country, 1/3 of their hires are outstanding, 1/3 of their hires are okay, marginal at best, and 1/3 of their hires are outright failures. How'd you like to be that general manager who made the decision years ago not to draft Michael Jordan. Do you think he thought about it? Do you think he studied? Do you think he was thorough in putting everything together? Do you remember who went it before Michael Jordan? Sam Boyd? Yeah. How would you like to be the guy who made that? How many points did that guy score in his lifetime? Did he score 500? Probably not. It's easy to make bad decisions. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about this. I have a whole seminar I do on this. My doctorate I'm going to eventually put a book on this. But find the right people. You've got to be thorough. The simplest thing I can say is I never hire anyone until I know why I wouldn't hire them. If you don't know why you wouldn't hire the guy, you haven't done enough research. That sounds strange because it's kind of like being 14 in love. Oh, she's perfect. Oh, he's wonderful. No, they're not. Okay?
Excuse me, Pastor.
Yes?
Do you make sole decisions on your staff?
We are moving away from that. I work with a personnel team, but we're at a point now where we have staff members hiring staff members at this point. One of the things I do is I have staff members stay with me when they come up and visit. And, of course, it helps that my wife's a therapist, and she does a psychoanalyst on them while they're staying with us. And I'm joking, but it's only a little bit of my joking, okay? I mean, more than once she says, you do not want to hire that person, okay? But I'll have people who are candidating come and actually stay in our home with us. I had one guy who just adamantly refused. I mean, just blew a gasket. No, I'm not going to your house. What are you going to watch me while I sleep? Da-da-da. And 5 years later, I was talking to another guy, and the church had split. And he said, oh, yeah, we had this person, and he just destroyed our church. And then we began to describe the guy. I said, I know that guy. He wouldn't come and spend the night in our home. And that sounds strange, but I do reference checks until I find one negative reference. I don't quit with one negative reference. The best references on staff members, talk to secretaries. I'm amazed at some of the references I've got in secretaries. So one time I called church in Oklahoma, and they were on a staff member meeting, and they was talking to the secretary, and the secretary said, well, I'm a receptionist, and I don't get to go to the staff meetings. In fact, I'm not even a member of the church. I'm Assembly of God. I said, well, I was just going to do a reference check on this guy. Who would be the best person to call me back? She said, well, I can have any of them call you back, but they won't tell you the truth. I said, well, what's the truth? She said, well, the truth was that the guy left on a Wednesday, and the following day on a Thursday, we had a party. And she said, that's the truth. I'm done. I don't have to do any more work. I'm done, okay? You know, if somebody's so bad that people have a party that you left, I don't need to know the rest of the story, okay? You know, that's the wrong person. Encourage success. How can you encourage people to do their best, to be their best? Encourage success. You know what? Have people doing the right things. There's a great book came out recently called Strength Finders. Don't have people spending all their time on their weakness. You know, we'll take some youth minister and we'll start dumping all kinds of stuff. You need to do this, and now you need to do college, and now we want you to run the men's ministry, and now we want you to do this. And we start funneling all this stuff in. Man, if you don't have someone who's called to lead men's ministry, don't dump it on your youth guy. It's better for that to be defunct than to have some guy doing 5 things he's not called to do and he's not gifted to do. So what we do is we find someone who's gifted and talented to do something, then we give them 12 other jobs. Now, I understand if you're a small church, you can't have somebody who, I do 6th and 7th graders and that's my whole job. I understand it doesn't work that way. But I'm saying don't dump so much stuff on one guy that he's not going to be successful where he could be successful. Evaluate. Give feedback to your staff. Staff members should always be aware of where they could improve. I'm amazed at the number of people I meet who get fired and who tell me they had no idea why they got fired, what they got fired for, or they had no idea there was a problem until they got fired. Okay? Man, if somebody's underperforming, they should know for 6 to 12 months before they leave where they're struggling with. It's just basic management tools. Any questions about staff? Third, space. Do you have enough worship space? The optimum percentage in worship I think it's about 60% full. If you get to 80% full, it's time to start a new service. There's another number I want you to catch. I wish someone would have told me about this number earlier. Because I had drummed in my head when I was young. 80% is full, 80% is full, 80% is full. And then back in the early 90s, there was a big trend toward multiple services. Everyone, start a new service, start a new service, start a new service. And so we moved into our new 400-seat auditorium with 150 people. We got up to about 200 people. We were about 50% full. And you know what we did? I kept hearing people say, start a second service, start a second service. So we started a second service. And part of the reason we did was because we were out of Sunday school space. But suddenly, we went from 50% full to 25% full. And I'll never forget a visitor coming in and said, I keep hearing about this is the growing dynamic church where everything's happening. And, people don't really say that to you. There was a guy in our area, nice guy, little church of about 50 people. And he bought into this multiple service concept, and so he started an 8 o'clock service. And the town's about, it's in driving distance to our town. It's too far away, but I've got 100, 150 people from that town that drive in. And, I really want them to go to church in their community. That's where they need to be. And I noticed that I get a lot of people who visit that church and then come on our way. And so one time I pulled that pastor aside and just began to talk to him and began to ask him about dynamics in his church. And he was telling me about his doctorate was on moving your church. He's got a doctorate on moving your church from one service to 2 services. And so I asked him about the size of the church service. And he said, well, the first service we have 12 to 15. And the second service we have 35. Now, his auditorium seats about 180 to 200 people. And I said, what do people think when they come into your church? He said, well, they always tell me how much they enjoy it. I said, really? He said, oh, yeah, they tell me they like the message, they like the people, how friendly everyone is. I said, so they tell you how good the church is? Oh, yeah. I said, do they come back? So, well, no, that's a strange thing. They don't come back. I said, well, what do you think someone thinks when they walk into an auditorium that seats 200 people and there's 35 folks in there? He said, I don't know. What do they think? I said, I tell you, if I walked into a place that sat 200 people and there's 35 folks there, I would think that something bad had happened. The pastor had run off with the secretary, somebody had embezzled some money, that half the church had just left. I mean, you face it. And so I think 40% is your bottom number. Funny thing was that guy called me a month later and he said, my wife's really mad at you. I said, why is your wife mad at me? He said, she's been telling me for 3 years to get rid of that early service, and you told me once I got rid of it 2 weeks later, and she's mad at you. I said, yes.
Yeah, I'm the second pastor of a church plant, and we average between 60 and 80 people, but we set up every Sunday or every Saturday night in a athletic club in a gymnasium, and we have enough chairs to set up 200 chairs. So, I mean, typically, how say if we're expecting between 60 and 80,
60%.
set up
For 6. So if you're going 40% more chairs than you need. Yeah. Yes.
What measurement are you using for worship space? I read a book by Charles Orange several years ago. Southern Baptists have typically used 16 to 18 inches, basically.
Don't.
I mean, our understanding is you need to use 30 to 36 inches per person. And you think about that, if that's the case, then that cuts basically the typical Southern Baptist seating capacity in half.
If you use the 60% rule, you can use the 16 to 18 inches, okay? So when I'm using the 60% rule, architects will come in and they'll have whatever. When we designed our building, we actually we used 22 inches per pew, and we had our pews so that they sat 7 people based on 22 inches. Because what an architect will do is they'll say, okay, it's based on 18 inches, but you have 7 inches left over. But then when you add all the pews together, you round the third of the person up on 100 pews, and so now you seat an extra 30 people. Well, you can't get a third of a person on a pew. So when we designed our pews, we actually designed our pews down to the inches at 22 inches. I would just look at whatever formula you want to use. Either if you want to go 16 to 18 inches, then figure you're only going to run 60 to 80% of your capacity, or you could figure bigger pews. If you want to use 30 inches, which is too big, then you don't have to use the 60% rule because you've already basically used, or you don't have to use the 80% rule because you've already used it in your front end. So you either got to figure out your formula on the front end or the back end. Either one's okay. Does that make sense? Yes.
When you go to multiple services, even when you were that small, I mean, I've been told that until you get to a certain size, it becomes really hard to have like a critical mass to do the two services.
I agree. I don't think you should go to multiple services. We added a new service at 8:15. There were some faces there that didn't come before. When we relocated, we got rid of our 8 o'clock service. We lost some folks. We had several families leave and not come back because they wanted the 8 o'clock service. So you will pick up new faces by having a new service. My question is going to be, if you're in an auditorium that seats, if you're in an auditorium that seats 200, and you're going to put 15 people at 8 o'clock, the negative's too great. You're going to have 35. The negative's too great. We added that 9:15 service 2 years too early.
And you have to have children's ministries to support.
Absolutely. That's the challenge. So you've got to have the staff to undergird it. So I would wait as long as you can, but at the same time, if you're in a room this size, let's say your church plant, and you're at 90% capacity in a room this size, you don't have any choice. You're going to lose that momentum either way. Even if you make a mistake and you have to go back to one service, you haven't lost that much. Yes?
We're in a relatively small space, about 180 people, and we're running 4 services. And we added the third service as a vehicle for growth as opposed to needing the space.
Mm-hmm.
We read a statistic that said that church people are comfortable and excited when it's 80%, 75, 80% full. But for new folks, it makes them uncomfortable. They say that actually 60% is...
That's my number. 60% is, I think, the perfect number. I think at the same time, if you drop below 40%, then you're starting to have a problem. And if you get much below 40%, you get down to 30, 20%, it just looks ugly.
I don't know the way that our auditorium seats are 200 and about 70 on Sunday morning. How do you overcome that?
You're fine. You're not down to 40%. You do need to get more bodies in there, and that's a problem because I think your auditorium at a certain point almost becomes a negative.
Yeah, we've tried to rope off pews to push people forward but at the same time, it has drawbacks.
Mission churches really have an advantage. You know what? I've done it before, and I did this actually when we went to 2 services, and I noticed that when we first went to 2 services, initially we did 8 o'clock. Now, here's the exception to the rule. If you do 8 o'clock, it doesn't matter. Someone can walk into our auditorium at 8 o'clock. If you've got 200 people at 8 o'clock, it's 8 o'clock. It doesn't matter if it's 1,000 seats, it's 20%. It's 8 o'clock. It's okay to be at 20% 8 o'clock. When we went to 9:15 and 10:45 initially, our 10:45 service was about 45% of capacity. And then our other service was at about 55, 60% capacity. We needed to make the split. We couldn't get quite balanced. And so you know what we did? We pulled out some pews. We pulled out the back 2 or 3 rows of pews. If you got chairs, chairs are a real advantage because you can manipulate not the size of the room, but the number of chairs. What you may want to do is if you're at 70 to 200 and you've been stuck at 70 for a while, I'd pull out a few pews. I wouldn't make a drastic change, but I'd just discreetly, one week I just had the custodians pull out the last 2 rows of pews and didn't tell anyone. And a couple people figured it out. We just put them back in. We put them back in about 3 or 4 months ago. Actually, about 6 months ago. That was my way of delaying the 8:15 service. But I would pull out a couple pews if you can do so discreetly. If it's got to be a big fuss, I'm not sure it's worth the fuss. But I think it would help some. Yeah. All right. What time is it?
10:33.
Oh, we're great. Bible study space. Do you have enough Bible study space? And I don't just want to talk about space, but also units. If you're not starting new Bible study units, your church is not going to grow. had a church in our area come to me recently, different non-denominational church, and it was a newer church, about 3 or 4 years old. And they brought their whole leadership team to meet with me, and they said they wanted to know why they weren't growing and if I could help them. And when they showed up, I said, guys, I'm not sure that I can talk to you for 30 minutes and diagnose why your church isn't growing and figure out how we can make it grow. And so we just started chit-chatting. I said, I'll do what I can. And as we began to talk, I started asking questions. And one of the questions I asked them was, how many small groups did you have when you launched the church? I said, well, we had 8 small groups. And I said, well, how many small groups do you have now? 12? He said, well, no, we have 3 small groups now. So we're done. That's it. I mean, it's pretty simple. I don't know what else is going on in Life of Church, but if the number of small groups you've got is declining, then your church is going to decline. You've got a church that runs 150 people, and you've got 12 Sunday school classes, and 2 years later, you've got 10 Sunday school classes. Man, your church is going to decline, okay? Now, I know we all don't do Sunday school the same way. We do a traditional Sunday school model. 85% of our folks are in Sunday school, which we put a high premium on. One way or the other, you're going to have some kind of small group connection, whether it's through ministry, whether it's through weekday Bible studies, whether it's through evening Bible studies, whether it's through Sunday school. You've got to have that, and that's part of the growth engine. And if your classes, if you don't have enough space for your classes, if you don't have enough classes, your church isn't going to grow. Parking is basically, the rule of thumb is 1 parking spot for every 2.5. I like 1 parking spot for every 2 people that attend your church. Lyle Schaller says he can go to your church and he can count your parking spots and tell you what your attendance is. And I've started doing that. When I go to someone's church, I'll usually count their parking spots on the way in. And when I go in, I'll usually tell them what their attendance is. I'll bet you run about 250. Yeah, how'd you know that? Parking spots. When we relocated, we built 2 of the biggest parking lots you could ever imagine. Yes?
So if you have a decent amount of sanctuary space, but maybe you're running out of parking, people park way down the street, or you don't have the Sunday school space, how do you reconcile starting a new service at that point?
You know, Sunday school is easier resolution because on Sunday school, you can make a decision to go off-site, to go alternate times, okay? Sunday school doesn't have to be Sunday morning. What I'm just basically talking about there is really small groups. Is there a connection back to the church life? A great stat, 85% of the people in your church that are part of a small group will still be part of your church 5 years from now. 85% who are not, will not. Great stat to know. So you can do that anytime. Those folks can come back on Sunday night. They can meet in their homes on Monday. That's fine. Parking's a little tougher. Now, on parking, starting additional services can help you if you have a gap for one group to leave and one group to come in. I got flack Sunday. We were worried about time. I'm not a short-winded preacher. And 8:15, we nailed it. At 9:30, we had a ton of baptisms, and we don't normally have this, but we had a spontaneous testimony off the floor. And then we had a capital campaign update, it was 5 minutes long, and we went too long. And where we got nailed was we got nailed in the parking lot. That's what I heard about. I heard the parking lot was packed because we didn't let this service out in time for the next service to come in. And so you can adjust that. So if your issue is parking, if you got multiple services, you want to have enough time that one group can leave and the next group can come in to fill up your parking lot. So parking is tough. Now the number is going to be different. Where do you minister at? Okay, so I know where you're at. When I talk to the guys in Maywood and Southside down there, I mean, parking is different because they have so many people who use mass transit. In Plainfield, you don't have mass transit. You've got to park them. And that's why we got 75 acres. Because we just made a decision. If we can't park them, we can't have them. And so that's the philosophy that you've got to figure out. How can we lick that parking monster? And I think that's the biggest monster that most churches face. Pardon?
Do you run any shovels?
We don't run any shovels. We're blessed and we're surrounding our building literally with parking, so we don't have to deal with those kind of issues. Someone once said 3 keys to church growth are parking, parking, parking. Defining moment of our church. Defining moment was we had a guy, every community kind of has like this bigger than life figure. We have a bigger than life figure in our community. A little town of 500 where I came there. There's a guy named Walter Patton, 6'2", 220, giant guy, but just a gentleman. But also probably could whip any guy in town in his day. And he fought from D-Day all the way into Germany, got all the war stories with General Patton. And Walt's the kind of guy everybody loves, and his wife Lou had been part of our church since 1952, but Walt never came to church. And when we were building our sanctuary the first time back in 89, 90, Walt came out and spent 40 hours a week working on the sanctuary. Didn't come to church, but worked in the sanctuary. We built 2 education wings. Walt came out and spent 40 hours a week working on our building. Didn't come to church. And so I pulled Walt aside one time and I said, Walt, this Sunday I'm going to recognize those who helped work on the building. I'd like to recognize you. He said, oh, no, Pat, no. I said, Walt, if I don't recognize you, that's going to be embarrassing to me, to the congregation, for not recognizing one of the 3 to 5 guys who spent the most time out here. That would be insulting to me not to have the privilege to recognize and thank you. All right, Pastor, I'll come. Well, I recognize the people who worked in the building, and I recognize 3 to 5 guys who literally spent 40 hours a week working on the building. And Walt wasn't there. And so I called, and Walt, just this huge integrity factor, and I called Walt up, and I said, Walt, I was really disappointed. You embarrassed me. I told you it'd embarrass me if you weren't there. So, Pastor, I came. I said, you came? You weren't there. He said, I came. I drove to the parking lot. There wasn't anywhere to park. And I went home. Now, we were still a small church that, if we were going to add a parking lot, that was 5 business meetings and 12 votes and 3 research committees. Man, we had a new parking lot on Friday. And all I did was I always went back to the gatekeepers of the church, and I said, Walt Patton was here Sunday. We didn't see Walt. Where was Walt at? He said he went to the parking lot. I couldn't park. I said, we need to have a new parking lot. You're right, Pastor. I said, we need to have it this week. You're right, Pastor. And we put a parking lot in 1 week. Praise God, Walt since has been saved, comes to church every Sunday. But there are some defining moments in the life of your church, and that parking issue was a defining moment. Okay, parking is real essential. Next, land. Do you have enough land? Do you have enough space? Basically, you're going to have 1 acre for every 100 in attendance. Okay, you have 3 acres. Your max is basically going to be 300 people. If you have 5 acres, your max is going to be 500 acres. Now, you can be creative. You can do some different things. You can have Saturday night services. There was a Chinese church that used to run 1,200 in Southern California on 2 acres. Okay? But, people are parking a half mile away, and they're getting shuttled in, and if you look at what they're really parking on, they're really parking over 20 acres. Okay? So, basically, 1 acre per 100 structure. Number 1. Your organization needs to be designed for growth. Remember in Revelation 3:7, he says, to the angel of the church of Philadelphia? Who's the angel? Yeah, that's the word for messenger. It's to the pastor. There needs to be a leader. It needs to be defined. I think one of the big struggles is most churches don't really have a pastor. They may have a matriarch or a patriarch, but they don't have a pastor. When I came to First Baptist Church in Maryville, there was a wonderful couple who he was the treasurer of the church, the chairman of the deacons, the chairman of the building committee, the chairman of the trustees, and he taught the Sunday school class. She led women's ministry, church secretary. That was my secretary. She was the church clerk. She was the financial secretary. You got the picture. These 2 people had 13, 5 minutes? These 2 people had 13 jobs between the 2 of them. Who was the pastor? Yeah, Sam and Joyce were the pastor. I just preached on Sunday. Your organization needs to define who's the pastor. Now, I was there 5 years before I became the pastor. I can tell you the story sometime. It's quite the story, but it's going to take time to define that. The operation of the church. How do you guys function? What's the purpose? What's the direction? And then finally, opposition within the church. There's going to be opposition. It will happen. Hard times will come. What's critical is your church willing to address those hard times? When I came to the church, there was a lady who was leading worship, who led worship because she sang louder than everyone else combined. That was why she led worship. We had no PA system. We had no sound. Special music was you brought your boombox, you put your tape in, you sang over it. Well, after a couple years, God sent someone who was a perfect fit for our church. Now, how do you remove the lady who's been doing that for generations? I went back to our nominating team, and when I enlisted the nominating team, here's what I did. I asked the members of the nominating team, before I enlisted them, I said, we've got to make a tough decision this year. And I need to know if you're willing to make it. And everybody knew exactly what, there was no doubt. Everybody knew what that decision was. And I had at least one, if not two people say, Pastor, I agree with the decision. I support the decision, although I can never publicly say that. And I need to decline serving on that nominating team. We made the decision. It was a good decision. It was a hard decision. But if we had not made that decision, our church would not have grown. It's that simple. If we would not have made that decision, we would not be where we are today. So you're going to have to deal with opposition. Fifth, leadership. Pastor is critical. 91% of people choose what church they attend based on the pastor. Doctrine matters. 89% of lost people choose their church based on doctrine. Doctrine matters. What you preach and what you believe matters. Third, delegates. Delegates. It is so important that we learn to delegate and pass on authority. Man, can I get 6 minutes out of here? I got 6 minutes or 7 minutes? You got 3? 2. Oh, man. Okay. I got a great story I'll tell you next year. Staying with momentum. Number 1, if you don't take anything else away from this, join God where He's at work. Where is God at work in your church? Join Him there. Focus on that. Finally, don't do anything dumb. Don't do anything dumb. Let me ask you a question. When was the last time you heard about a pastor falling into immorality who wasn't doing anything? Almost every time that I hear about someone falling, it's somebody that God's just really using, that the ministry's thriving, that great things are happening. And when God begins to use you, I think Satan wants to abuse you. And I think the simplest thing I can say is don't do anything dumb. The best thing I've done over the last 21 years, is not quit. Is not quit. April 1864. We're going to go over the tape, but I'm going to tell the story anyway. I skipped 3 others. April 1864. Ulysses S. Grant moved the Army of the North south against Robert E. Lee. Grant had over 100,000 men. Lee was down to about 25,000 men. But nobody could beat Bobby Lee. And every spring, the Northern Army had marched south against Lee, and every spring they had been soundly defeated and turned around and marched back north. And there was no reason why the soldiers would expect any other different outcome. They had gone down multiple years before only to lose, and there they were one more year heading south. And as they headed south, they met Bobby Lee in the wilderness of Northern Virginia in April 1864. And there they were, vastly outnumbering Robert E. Lee, but one more time, they lost to Lee. They lost bad. And so the soldiers waited for the orders to come, the orders to say, march north. And the orders came. The order said, march east by southeast. Soldiers were surprised. They began to march. As they marched, they met Lee at Spotsylvania in May of 64. Lee soundly beat Grant again. They waited for the orders to say go north, but they got the orders. The order said go east by southeast. They went to Cold Harbor. Grant thought if he could beat Lee to Cold Harbor, he could get behind his army and defeat him and cut him off from Richmond. Lee beat Grant to Cold Harbor, and in 20 minutes, more men died on the Union side than died all day long at Gettysburg at Pickett's Charge. You remember Pickett's Charge, but we don't remember that in 20 minutes, 7,000 Union soldiers were piled body upon body, one of the biggest, fastest carnages in American history. The soldiers knew how devastating the loss was. A full division of men, totally devastated. And they waited for the orders to come because they'd been beaten, and they'd been beaten bad and fast and soundly to go north. The orders came. East by southeast. And all summer long, all spring long, into the fall, Grant kept fighting Lee, kept losing to Lee, but kept moving east by southeast, until eventually he'd circled all the way around Lee. By the winter of 1864, Grant had never defeated Lee, but his army was south of Richmond. The war was over. Grant never beat Lee on the battlefield until a year later, when Lee's army had all but disappeared, was a ghost of what it once was. But what he had never won on the battlefield, he won in the war because he did what his predecessors could not do. He didn't quit. The best thing you can do in ministry is not resign on Monday morning. Is to continue to be faithful as God's called you to be faithful. Let me pray for you. Father God, allow us to be faithful back to you. Allow us to continue the race you've called us to run. In Jesus' name, amen.